We are live. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for attending. This is going to be Randal Schwartz talking about half of his life with Perl. I could have said, well, Randal Schwartz needs no introduction, but some of you may not know him. So he jumped into the Perl boat when it was very small, and it was basically just Larry Wall developing the language. And he's been involved in working with Perl and doing presentations and writing books about Perl since pretty much the beginning, 87. And 10 years ago, moved on to other things, but he's going to give a talk about Perl. And it's quite an interesting story with a lot of twists and turns. So I won't speak for very much longer. Randal, please take it away.
Oh, thank you. Let me bring up the slide deck here, if I remember how that all works here. Push that button there. Oops, let me share first. That's got to be the case. Share and share alike. You should see a blue screen now. If I press share, there we go. That is a screen, but now I'll bring up Keynote on there. Okay, can you see my slides?
Yep, looks great, Randal. Please go ahead.
I won't be able to how do I get rid of the little tab thing out of the way? I hate that when it does that. Oh, that's in the wrong place. Oh, you won't see that over there anyway. All right. Cool. So I am Randal Schwartz. I've been that name all my life. That's pretty silly, but that's the name that was given to me. I've had a really long career, which I will reference parts of in this talk, the earlier parts more than the later parts. This talk was originally presented at OSCON about 12 years ago. And at that point, Perl had just turned 25, and I had just turned roughly 50. And so I pitched this talk in order to capture some of the history of how Perl came about and the different things that happened, and also kind of how I came about in order to be in the right place at the right time to help with Perl as how it went. As I was writing the title to this talk, Half My Life with Perl, I actually looked at that and said, really, I kind of wish that if I can get the buttons to work, I really kind of wish that it would be my half-life with Perl, but that doesn't make any sense except in a sort of radioactive decay sense. So, but I thought that would be a fun title. So let's talk a little bit about me. I like to consider myself the jack of all trades, but the master of only some. But enough to make a living, a pretty decent living most of my life, and also to be of great use to people. So my skills that I've sort of promote that I have are being a programmer, writer, trainer, sysadmin, QA, networking, DevOps, podcaster. We'll talk a little bit about that later. Comedian. I've actually been paid to do stand-up comedy, crazy stuff like that. I'm also thinner. I found low-carb eating about 12 years ago, kind of when this talk was written, and lost a significant number of pounds really quickly. Unfortunately, I now look more like the beginning picture now again, as 12 years seems to have accumulated. So anyway, and what I want to talk about, and what this talk is particularly addressing, is the intertwinedness of Perl culture. How did Perl come and exist? Stonehenge culture, Stonehenge being my company, the company I created around all of my activities after I worked for a couple of other companies and I finally got out on my own. That was something like 35 years ago. So I've been sort of independently the owner of Stonehenge for that length of time. And although this is kind of a weird way to say, it's kind of like me personally. How did I influence both of those and vice versa? How did that happen? And a lot has happened. Is somebody trying to speak? I'm hearing noise. Okay. A lot has happened. And again, I'm getting older and even now older. and my memory isn't as good as it once was. So please consider this presentation a work of fiction, but inspired by actual events. That's probably the right way to look at it. So you might disagree with some of the actual facts. That's fine. This is as I recall it, as it happened to me that I can remember at this point in my life. And if you disagree with my facts, you can do your own presentation, give your own talk. I do want to thank to the people that have been contributing to the Perl history timeline, though, because that actually reminds me of things that have happened in the history of Perl that I might not have otherwise known or understood. But a good chunk of the Stonehenge culture and my personal history comes from the input of one guy that I knew for 30 years. Unfortunately, he passed away of a heart attack about 12 years ago, and so no longer around. But he influenced Stonehenge and influenced Pearl. Any of you who've met Bill know what I'm talking about. He was a force to be reckoned with. So he did a lot of things around me and with me. So he passed away in 2013, and I miss him dearly. And so, yeah. But let's go back to me. Bill's a great guy, but he's gone. So I wanted to talk about how I came to Pearl, how I had organized my life so that it was the right thing for me to do at the right time. I did choose to be a career programmer at age 10. I kind of liked what I saw that computers were doing. And keep in mind, this is in 1970-ish. So still pretty early where computers were really only used for banks and governments and stuff. I'm continuing to hear sounds. Is somebody not got their mic muted? Because that's a little weird.
It sounded like there was some random noise. Sorry. I'm just
Okay.
muting people who are interrupting. Please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. And so again, I kind of liked where I thought computers were going. I thought I could eventually get a job at a government agency or a bank, at least sometime in the future. My actual introduction to programming was that the PDP-8 manual for the focal language somehow ended up in my possession. Well, my dad gave it to me from a trade he did with one of his clients. And I read through it, and I remember running out to our workshop with a piece of paper that had lines of code written on it. And I said to Dad out there, I said, Dad, this is what I want to do. I want to write this stuff. This is the kind of thing that I think I'm going to be good at. And the great part about that was that he acted on it. He said, yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that. And so through some coordination with my parents and the local school system, I got access to an ASR 33, all uppercase, amazingly noisy in a small room. At age 11, an HP 2000 timeshared basic was the language there. And I spent many hours of self-taught time with that equipment. So I learned how that all worked. And I stayed with that all the way through the end of high school. And even to the point where I took over the class from the teacher that was actually teaching it. I was actually teaching as a high school student. I was teaching other high school students how to program. And so that's why I knew that this was definitely my career. I built an MSI 8080, which is an 8080 based S100 bus based system, the beautiful one, the one that's in war games with all the colored blinky lights and stuff. I built one of those for the school, and I sort of really focused in on career development. I really hated everything else in school. I even flunked middle school English, and I took journalism in high school to avoid any real English exposure. Ironically, I became a writer later, but we'll get to that. um, but I really just didn't want to do much of anything else. I didn't really, I was sort of learning advanced math and stuff, but mostly I just wanted to learn how to program better and continue to get smarter about that. And I avoided writing. I earned points for typing and page layout. And that gave me the grades that I got in my journalism class. The only story I ever actually wrote was Randall assembles an IMSI 8080 for the school. So it was like, then of course, since I was the editor in chief at that point, I put it on front and center on page one. So that's the only real writing I did. So ultimately, when I applied for a writing job, they asked for my writing samples, and I said, I don't have it. I've just moved, and lied my way through that because really the only writing sample I had was this one article that I wrote about myself. So that was crazy. But what's great then is that as I came out of school, I started doing contract coding as I came out of high school. And I graduated out of high school early. I graduated a couple years early. Didn't go to second or third grade. No, did go to third or fourth grade or half my senior year. So that got me out early. And I immediately went into working, and I was making $30 an hour in 1977, which I consider pretty good. It's like 120 an hour today. And which means actually I haven't gained anything over the years about how much I make. It just followed inflation all the way up. Um, but those jobs were, few and far between. And so I ended up getting a summer temp job at our largest employer in the state at the time, which was Tektronix. There's like 22,000 employees at that point. And the summer temp job, though, was as a tech writer. And that was a great accident. I thought I was just getting the writing job because I would look around and try to find a programming job while I was on the inside. And that sounded like a great strategy, except after a few months of writing, I was having fun writing about programming topics. And so I said, maybe I'll just stay here. And they offered me a permanent job at the end of the summer. And what's great is that meant that I could take everything I had self-taught about programming and add it to things about learning how to write. I was essentially learning it on the job. And this came significantly from two people. My supervisor, Lyle Settle, was really good at seeing through how to take a technical subject and delivering it in a way that's organized and friendly and uh, easy to understand, easy to find information, good reference information, things like that. And so I really learned how to organize a book from Lyle. And technical editing, I learned from Jack Falk, the technical editor for the group. And I remember many interactions with him where ultimately he kept calling me out for um, not writing like I speak. And once I learned to write like I speak, it was much simpler, and my writing all of a sudden made sense. But it took me a while to figure that out, that that's really what you want to do. I ended up staying in that group for 4 years. So this is not the instant writer, then instant programmer kind of job path that I thought I was doing. But after 4 years, I said, okay, I'm going to try to find another position. But I had been migrated from a temporary position to a salaried position quickly, and I was the youngest salaried employee that they've had and the highest paid miner, pretty significant, and vacation and everything else. And at age 16, I was living in my own apartment and had a brand new car and all sorts of great stuff. So I was living the life. So after 4 years as a writer there, I then became a programmer, and I realized that there really wasn't much difference. It's just what art your media, what art or what medium your art is being expressed into. And yeah, the meetings were a little bit different, but really being a programmer was really the same as being a writer. And I stopped worrying about my job title at that point. And I think that was a significant thing in my life to just go, how can I be creative today? And look for opportunities that you might not have considered before just because of that. And somewhere around in here, and be in this timeline that I was at Tektronix, I discovered Larry Wall mostly through the RN newsreader. I was on Usenet because Tektronix was one of the original nodes back in 1981. And so I was able to start reading news and doing that. And RN became my primary newsreader for many years until the sysadmins saw that people were using RN way too long and often, and they made it nice automatically. And in Unix terms, that means it makes it a lower priority so that it can't tie up the CPU. And it also makes it hard to use because it's really slow. And so I shifted over to start using GNU Emacs to do my news reading. And they can't nice every instance of Emacs because that might be real work. So it worked out really nice. I just kind of snuck through there. Um, but I remember the RN man page, and that's the documentation. I was going, I really like this Larry guy. He's writing great stuff. So I wonder what else he's done. And I looked around and he had done the patch tool, which was how we ended up creating diffs and making things, applying the diffs anyway. Very, very cool tools. And then along came Perl from him. And of course, that meant I was automatically interested in it because I liked some of the other stuff Larry had already done. Perl 1 was released in 87. I started by downloading it, compiling it, playing it with a bit. And um, now this is back when they had Sharchives, which is basically multiple postings, any one of which could get lost. But they were numbered in sequential, and then you had to get them all and then run them in one big directory, and they would assemble up all the actual files. It was pretty cool. Um, Perl at that point looked like a smarter awk, and I'd been using awk quite a bit already. And so I thought, oh, I can shift some of these crazy things I was doing with awk over to Perl. I remember writing a load balancing system for writers and assignments and tasks, all in awk. It was a nightmare to maintain, but it did help us out figuring out which of our 7 writers were available during what periods of time. Pretty fun. So Perl 1, simple, just played with it a bit, didn't do much with it, but Perl 2 came out in 88 and it was a lot more complete. So it started being my go-to language for all my new tools, and I started rewriting some of my existing shell scripts for that as well. So that started to be a shift for me to actually get away from shell and awk and a bunch of other things. And I'd also written a lot of things in GNU Emacs Lisp too, believe it or not. I got really, really decent at Emacs Lisp. In fact, so good at it that I was complaining that they didn't have a pretty printer. So you couldn't take an arbitrary S expression and dump it out in a human readable way. It was all dumped out as one long line. And so I wrote the pretty printer and I posted it to the contribution mailing list for GNU Emacs. And Richard Stallman called it brilliant and put it as part of the standard package. So there's a little bit of me in every copy of GNU Emacs that goes out, the pretty printer. So next time you see loading pp.el, that's me. I did that. Perl's now being useful for me. I'm getting a lot of things done with it. So I start going back on Usenet and I started looking at CompuNix questions and CompuNix shell. This is before the Perl news groups. And tried to figure out if there's some of the things that were there that I could answer in Perl rather than answering it as a shell script. And I did that enough, apparently, that one day somebody said in their question, would someone be kind enough to provide me with a script? Said awk, no Perl, please. And at that point, I knew I had made an impact. Because if somebody's already saying no Perl, please, okay, I definitely have hit the mark on that one. So I would then show the shell solution and the shorter and faster Perl solution. And this did bring in a lot of early Perl adopters because people kept saying, well, what is this Perl thing? And why do you keep posting about it? So that was a lot of fun. So I had an early proselytization role with Perl and brought a lot of people over. Um, and then there's the JAF. Some of you may have heard of the Just Another Perl Hacker sign-offs that I did. They were sort of because almost every Usenet posting I made, it was just another something hacker. So it kind of depended in whatever I was posting to. It was like the Portland news group, so it would be just another Portland person or something. But they were all just another something something. And I got really bored of typing just another Perl hacker, just another Perl hacker every single time. So I went, okay, I'll write it as code. And that became a little more clever. So that was fine. And then I got bored because I was writing that one all the time, exactly the same way. And so I started actually making it executable code, and every one was slightly different from any other one. So I was trying really hard not to reuse them. And I had to keep coming up with different ideas, different ways of doing things. This one's in there. If anybody's smart about Perl, they know why we have to have the word scalar in that particular statement, but I'll just skip that and let you be curious about it later. But then we get really crazy ones like this. So this actually is executable code. The whole point of this code was to get EIEIO at the end, just so it would fit the song. And then I had to work out how could I use that, because that's a double E evaluation on a substitution operation. Crazy stuff, right? The nice thing is that string of just another Perl hacker with the comma is 25 characters. And that meant you had a 5 by 5 grid, and you could do some really cool things with that kind of mappings back and forth, and did that. And it's also slightly less than 26 characters, which led to some other interesting sort of things. Like this takes the phrase, "oh, turtleneck phrase jar," and rearranges the letters so that it says just another Perl hacker. And it does this by looking up the W is like the 23rd letter of the string, which is that capital J. So that's the J from just another. And so each one of those letters, W, F, T, E, D, are the indexes into the O turtleneck phrase jar string to get the right name out of that. And so that's the kind of craziness and cleverness that I've put in there. And no, I didn't compute that string by hand. I had Perl do the inverse of this to be able to get the string. And that's how that came about. And there is an FAQ about just another Perl hacker, and I do want to say that canonically, since I invented it, the comma must be included, regardless of what it says there. Um, I do believe that the Just Another Perl Hacker sign-offs helped inspire Obfuscated Perl and Perl Golf, and I'm actually kind of sad about that, because the first thing that people talk about when they talk about Perl is how weird the code all looks. It's because they're pointing out obfuscated Perl contests and things like that, and Perl Golf, where everything's trying to be shortened. That's not production Perl. Neither of those are for production. They are simply us playing around because we can. So, yeah, definitely not to be looked at as real stuff. So now we're up to Perl 3. Okay, it was released in 89. I was a lot more involved. I was actually on the alpha test team. The point of the test team was that Larry only had access to a handful of different kinds of machines, and he wanted it tested on a much broader set of machines. So he gathered us together to kind of be independent observers to try to figure out if Perl actually ran everywhere. This was actually the predecessor of what for many years was known as Perl 5 porters, which was the overarching body of people that made sure that each release came out and worked with Larry to kind of guide our way through. And then as Larry stepped back further and further, it just became the Perl Steering Committee, which is what it is now. I actually inspired by being on that list 3 features in Perl. So this is the only thing I can really claim to have contributed to Perl itself. You know, I've contributed a lot to the Perl culture, to the Perl community and everything like that, but these are the things I contributed in Perl. I invented the underscore file handle for tests so that you wouldn't have to keep doing a stat call to find out if it's both readable and writable. You could just simply do it once and use the underscore. I also invented the list slice. There was an array slice where you could stick it into an array variable and pull it back out using @ and square brackets. But there wasn't any way to do that with a literal list. And I suggested that to Larry, and he came up with a way, and the syntax is beautiful. I'm glad he did that. The third one I did is part of a story, so I'm going to have to wait until we get to that part of the story. What's great is that, of course, Larry got into it as well. He wrote his first Perl haiku, inspired by one of my jaffs. And here's the code for that. And that's literal Perl code that I think that still works, actually, even with modern Perl. So Perl's out there, people are using it, but there's not much more to read about except the Usenet postings and the online documentation. So how did the Camel come about? Because that was an important pivotal moment in Perl's history. Because the Perl 2-man page was about 20 pages long, normal size pages. The Perl 3-man page had gotten up to 60 pages. And it was just huge. It was well written. It was beautiful stuff. Larry writes great stuff for text descriptions. But interestingly enough, as this got posted to the net, we had a feedback from somebody on the, I think on the mailing list at that point, that said we need more documentation. And we're thinking, well, there was more. It's 60 instead of 20 now, but that's not what he meant. He meant we need more tutorial information. We need more sort of give me the simplest parts of Perl to teach me how to use this directly. And Larry's great. He said, yeah, okay, when I get some spare time, I'll get around to it. Now, keeping in mind that Larry, has a wife and 4 kids and is active in his church and had a day job, all that stuff, I knew that Larry had very little spare time from having had many conversations with him privately about where Perl was going. And so I chimed in right after him. I said, well, I can help. I was a tech writer for a long time, being professional paid tech writer. And I was also on the Alpha team. So I kind of know how the new Perl works. And I also know some of the motivations for some of the things. So I thought I might as well help Larry out, write something. Just again, imagining that it would be something that would be online for everybody to just download for free. But somebody at O'Reilly saw that, the big publisher of the Nutshell series and all those animal books that we have come to learn and appreciate. And they saw that and actually wrote me back privately and said, if you're going to write something, maybe we'll publish it. And I went, wow, it hadn't occurred to me. I had a shelf full of books that I had written, but they were written for companies. So there was the company name on the spine, not my name. And the idea of having a book with my name on it hadn't occurred to me until I got that very letter. And so that, again, pivotal time in my life. I've got that mail stored off somewhere in some archive tape. And that's a special thing for me because it really started a whole different career for me at that point. So I wrote Larry immediately and I said, hey, let's do a book. We can do a book. And I think I proposed either Pearls of Wisdom or Wisdoms of Perl as the title for it. And thank God he turned that down because that would have sucked for a title, actually. We did, although he lived in the Silicon Valley and I lived in Portland, Oregon, it turns out that he had relatives that lived just an hour south of me and was actually coming to visit them in about 2 weeks after this first interaction about this. And so I met him and we decided we could work together. We seemed to be fitting on a lot of the things. I told him my writing background as well as my programming background, and he was pretty excited about all that. But of course, about working together, there's this great quote from the great movie Xanadu. I don't know the first thing about being a partner. It's easy. We share the responsibilities and we argue a lot. It's like being married without the good part. And that's it. We were partners on writing the book, and it worked really well. The Camel was in fact written in T-ROF. I knew T-ROF really, really well because when I was at Tektronix in the writing group, I was managing all of the typesetting software, and essentially we were using a T-ROF tool chain to be able to put those up with some special set of macros that I had worked on. And so I understood T-ROF. And what's funny is that O'Reilly said, well, we have our own in-house macros. So here's the documentation for it. And you'll need to write it according to these standards so that we can use it in our typesetting system when we have it. And I was looking at their documentation for their in-house macros. And I said, why? Those look extremely familiar. And I realized it's because I had written those. They were using my macro package. And what had happened was a guy that worked for me at Tektronix, Steve Talbot, left to go work with Tim O'Reilly, actually on the first X books and stuff. And he had taken these macros with him. And then O'Reilly had adopted that for all of their books. And so 10 years later, come full circle, I'm writing a book for O'Reilly using the macros that I had originally created. So it was full circle all the way around. Really incredible. That amused me to no end that all these animal books that I'd seen on the shelf were written with my macros. It was like, hey, that was cool. There were no change control back then. Git wasn't even close to being around. I think we had SVN. No, not even SVN. I think it was SCCS. But the book was written entirely by email, UCP-based email, if you can believe it. So back in the day when you had to have the correct bang path, all the way down. Um, the great thing is that I got to bring into play everything I learned about writing award-winning books from my time at Tektronix. So again, I happen to be right place, right time, right background, right education to make a good book. Um, and we actually thank both Lyle and Jack in the preface of all the books that I write. So if you ever see Lyle and Jack, now you know the backstory for them as well. Uh, but I designed the book based on what I learned from Lyle. I even suggested the humorous index entries. The initial one, I think, well, the index and the glossary didn't have any entries in them. So I started putting in glossary entries like auto split, see midnight auto supply. And Larry sort of chuckled at those. He said, I said, can we do that? And he says, well, if we can keep it up, if we can keep the quality up for the entire glossary, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. So although I had only jokingly done that in books that I was producing for Tektronix, and then of course the editor would catch them and get rid of them, we actually got away with that for the first Camel. So that was a lot of fun. I also am the one who came up with the distinction that Perl, all lowercase, is the interpreter. Perl with an initial cap, P, is the language. And that's because the word Perl, when it was all lowercase, was disappearing into the sentences. And I thought, well, Perl is really a proper noun. It should be capitalized if it's being used as a language. And so that was my invention. We wrote the book in 6 months of nights and weekends. And then Larry decided that Perl was 3 at the moment, 3044, that whatever we would have when the book came out, we would call that Perl 4 by rolling the version of Perl over. And then we wrote in the book is about Perl 4, and that's how we synchronized the version number with the book number. Of course, in the prefaces, I'm writing the final preface, I go, but it might actually be 4003 because of changes after we submit the book. Kind of just a joke that Perl never sits still. And that's just a tribute to the way Larry works, all those times that Larry does things. And what's funny, of course, is he actually artificially released 3 patches just so that the preface was right. So it was it was really symbiotic. The book, the language, Larry, me, it just kept being really interesting working together. We released the Camel at and actually I met Larry then for the second time at Usenix in 1991 in Dallas when they were making the final travel arrangements. They said, you mind sharing a room? I said, I probably don't mind, but anybody who hates my snoring probably would. But he said, well, do you know Larry Wall? And I said, yeah, actually I do. I've just spent the last 9 months working with him online. So yeah, we signed hundreds of copies of the Camel One there. It just went like hotcakes. Larry had his special Camel stamp. It turns out that the Camel woodcut on the original first edition Camel was the same as an old set of 18th century classic woodcuts. And he found a store that happened to have that particular design, amazingly enough. So that's how he kept stamping everything with the Camel. And he gave me the Llama one too, which is pretty cool. It became a runaway bestseller, which actually caused the O'Reilly Company to think differently. They had to react to this. They normally print enough books for a year in their first print. We went through that entire supply in the first 2 months. So we blew expectations by a factor of 5 out of the water. And so this got them really rethinking, wait, how can we do more books like this, and so on. But the other thing that was interesting about it is that people started writing me saying, thank you, now I can officially use Perl. And I would challenge them about why, and they'd say, well, my boss wouldn't let me use something when it was just something I downloaded, but now that there's a book, and I hadn't realized the leverage that would be. Because, of course, this pointy here boss is not trusting things that don't have printed docs. So it sort of empowered an entirely new group of people that now could use it because it's real. Okay. So the llama has a similar origin story. Again, after publishing the Camel, on a Silicon Valley company, I believe it was Taos Mountain Software, as I recall, approached me about teaching Perl. And I thought, oh, I've done some teaching. I was teaching programming in high school. I taught a couple of classes for Tektronix Continuing Ed in Pascal. And so I said, okay, I can do that. They set it up with a contract that as long as I didn't compete on their turf, in other words, Silicon Valley, I could teach it anywhere I wanted. So I could take that same courseware and take it other place. So I wrote up a course. They owned the course itself, but I retained the rights to all the examples because good examples are hard to create. And I didn't want to have to create them for my own course, knowing that eventually I'd want to do my own. Um, and Larry's daughter, I believe it was Geneva, named the diamond operator for me. I was over at Larry's house and I kept going, what do you call that thing, the less than greater than thing? And Larry said, well, I call it the less than, I don't call it anything because we just type it, right? We just write it out. Larry's daughter was sitting there and said, that's a diamond, Daddy, diamond. And that's how the diamond operator got its name. I named the spaceship because it looked like a spaceship from an old Star Wars or Star Trek game I was playing. Because again, I needed something to say as I was doing the vocalization of learning Perl. How do you describe this less than equal to greater than without saying less than equal to greater than over and over again? Now, fascinatingly enough, and this is how the Llama book came about, was after about the third or fourth class that I taught, somebody came up to me and said, I really like the Camel, great writing, good stuff. I can find stuff in it. But this Llama course is teaching me the information in the proper order. And that gives me an idea. If this book teaches the proper order, or this material teaches the proper order, then maybe we should have a book that's based on that. So I pitched a Perl tutorial book to Tim. And what's funny is, I think this is my fastest pitch acceptance ever. I got a phone call, an actual phone call from Tim O'Reilly, and 15 minutes later saying, we've been waiting for you to say anything after the Camel, because your Camel is like our hottest selling book. So I said, sure, okay, I'll do the Llama book then. I wrote the Llama pretty much on my own over the next 6 months. I had one of it was and I also took the course that I had written for Taos, and I threw away all the slides, but I kept the examples, and I wrote a different course that was based on that, mostly based on my experience then of having taught the Taos course, about what things were being easily accepted and what things needed more backup material, things like that. So a totally new slide deck, and I started delivering that in Portland area, again, in parallel with writing the book. And here's where my life takes another twist, another turn. The Llama 1 was released on 1st of November, 1993. And that's a date I'm always going to remember because just another convicted Perl hacker. On the day that the Llama was released, I was confronted by the local constabulary about activities that I had been performing at my client at the time, which was Intel. Make a long, long story short, I have like a full hour and a half talk I can do on this, but I'm not doing that today. I was convicted of 3 felonies for essentially doing my job with too much enthusiasm. That's pretty much it. I spent 6 figures on lawyers and fines and retribution. $67,000 of that was paying Intel back for the damage I did to them, whatever that means. And again, this doesn't count the collateral damage to me. I lost a couple of really nice contracts as a result because they wouldn't hire a felon at that point, that sort of stuff. And again, because of the restrictions on pretrial bail restrictions and also post-conviction probation restrictions, I couldn't work for anybody that didn't know about this. So I had to get something on their letterhead that said, we are aware that you are a convicted felon or are about to be a convicted felon. But I asked the judge for an exception for training because I said, in training, I'm not really exposed to their internal networks or anything like that. So can I get an exception for training? And the judge granted that, which was nice, because all of a sudden then Stonehenge got reinvented as a Perl training company, right? Because now I could do training full time. I couldn't do coding because I'd have to get the stupid letter from their legal department, but I could definitely go in and be a trainer. Now it's just oddly at every place I was trained, I was on the internal network. So it was like I still had access to everything. So shh, just don't tell the judge. This is all over with anyway. Oops. Um, so Pro 5 came along in 1995. And again, finally objects. And I knew a lot about objects. I really knew a lot about objects because I've been playing with objects back when Smalltalk came out at Tektronix. Tektronix had one of the first outside implementations of a Smalltalk device outside of Xerox. They were one of the 3 partners selected to create something with a mouse and Windows and stuff like that. And so I was in a group that was using one of these machines, the Magnolia, they called it. And I got to play with Smalltalk quite a bit. So I learned objects from there, from the original source. And the Camel and the Llama book, of course, were becoming slowly out of date. Perl 5 added all this object stuff. Perl 5 also added references, which was amazing. So I created a Llama supplement for the Perl 5 features. And initially it started as just a 4-hour course, and then eventually became packages, references, objects, and modules, which I abbreviated to the PROM internally. And as we were talking about it amongst my staff, I would just say the PROM class because it was too hard to say all the letters. And it's nice that those happen to spell the right letters the right direction. That also became the Alpaca book. So once the PROM course had been delivered enough times, I pitched that to O'Reilly, and that became the Alpaca book. In the midst of all this, you might have heard of this little thing called the Schwartzian transform. I answered a Usenet question in April of 1995. That's interesting because they're saying that Monday is the 30th anniversary of the Schwartzian transform, but that math does not work out. I think that's not the right article then. I think there was a December article that triggered something as well. Otherwise, they wouldn't say that Monday is the 30th anniversary. Anyway, so let's get back, whatever timeline it was on. I answered a Usenet question. The Usenet question was something about sorting files that were made up of lines that looked something like the password file with colon separated fields, and how do we sort that based on that? I was actually teaching a course, and I was coming out during my breaks catching up with Usenet. I didn't have a lot of time to give an answer, so I basically just wrote the answer. And the answer was really short. It was just, here, try this. And it was from my Emacs Lisp days, I learned to do something called decorate, process, or sort, or whatever, and undecorate. And that was a very common thing to do in languages like Lisp. And so I just posted it and then went away. And then about a day later, I come back, and Tom Christensen had replied to that posting, sort of starting with, how dare you thrust such a complicated set of code without explaining it? And so he first pointed out my bug. Yes, I trimmed the new lines off, but never put them back on. Oh yeah, I didn't have the right output, never ran it. But he described my 5 lines in absolute detail. And it is an amazing piece to read, by the way. I definitely suggest you go look it up if you're even curious about this. He named it the Schwartzian transform, sort of as in spite, and I only know this by what I'm about to talk about in a second. But he was sort of saying, coming back around to my original code, building up to it one step at a time. And he said, now let's go back to the original Schwartzian transform, meaning sort of despising it a little bit. But what happened was somebody saw that name and they started answering using that name. So they would say, oh, what you need to do is use a Schwartzian transform here. And I could almost see Tom getting crazy every time he would read one of those. Because like, no, I didn't mean it as a nice term. I meant it as an evil term. So it clearly upset him. Because he tried later to call it the black transform. And that's a play on my last name being the word black in German. And that never stuck. So, that obviously people like Schwartzian transform. What's interesting is that Schwartzian transform has now generic. It's been ported to other languages. In particular, there is in the language B as in Bravo, There's a Schwartz sort. It's actually the name of the operator, Schwartz sort. I'm like, wow, that is so cool. All right, so I've been immortalized as an operator in a language. Um, Camel 2 was released in September 96. Again, Tom Christensen got brought in as one of the co-authors, and Stephen Potter, who later dropped out of the project, but he still got his name on the front cover. Uh, I was really at this point because I was pretty busy doing the training company and trying to make enough money to pay my lawyers and stuff that I didn't really couldn't really spend a lot of time actually on the book. And so my schedule was crazy. I didn't do a lot of original writing. This, by the way, from a historical perspective, was the first book to be written in Pod. So prior to that, Camel 1 was in TROF, the macros that I wrote. And the Llama one was in FrameMaker, and you don't even want to know what FrameMaker is if you don't already know. It's just a WYSIWYG edit text editor layout program. Um, Horrible thing. Doesn't run anywhere that I know of anymore. So there it is. But luckily, all of the books that we did from there in the future with the Perl stuff was all in Pod. And it's sort of pseudopod because there's pod with some extensions for O'Reilly's particular needs for production use. And so that's kind of how the Camel 2 came about, is that it was mostly not me, which is great. I moved away from the Camel by that point. I didn't work at all on Camel 3, and I focused entirely on the Llama and the Alpaca series after that. Um, so one of the things that happened because Larry was sort of stepping back a little bit as project leader is that there were people who we call the pumpkins that were in charge of the various releases. And it turned out that Chip Salzenberg, who had worked with me as one of my instructors for a while, very sharp guy, had been the pumpkin for 5004. And he was an amazing character, brilliant character. I say was like he's no longer. No, he's still fine and doing well. I don't know if he's doing Perl these days, but definitely was a sharp cookie there. He was amazingly adept at fixing bugs. So if you were watching Profile Porters during this period, especially during the closing days of 5004, getting the release out, you would see someone post a question or a bug, and like almost immediately Chip would post the response to fix it. I mean, it was like within minutes sometimes. And it was like, how the heck is he doing that? How is he fixing these bugs so quickly? And then we figured out that it must be that he has the entire source code for the entire Perl 5 interpreter in his head somewhere. And he's actually typing the diff directly into the mail. And so that's how he's getting it done so fast. And then he has some tool that automatically reads his own mail and applies the patches to keep the on-disk version synchronized with the version that was on in his head, right? But he used to tell that same story at conferences when I was talking about him that way, and then he said, "It's not true. It's not true. I had to apply the patch manually." So that he carried it one step further, made it even funnier. And of course, one night I came back in after, there's like, I come in the morning and there's like 15 patches from Chip. And so I said, oops, hold on. Somebody must have left the Salzenberg on overnight was my response to that. So it was pretty cool. RC2, which is one of the gold masters, showstoppers only at this point, was released. That was awesome. We knew we were just about to have 5004 with all of its new features and maybe new bugs, but hopefully not very many bugs because Chip had been working on those. And I had an IRC conversation with Chip. And I said, of course, congratulations on RC2 and hitting the gold master for the final release. And he thanked me for that. And then I said, yeah, it's too bad you didn't get the code ref arrow in. And he goes, what's that? And I said, well, you know how with a hash, you can have hash ref arrow element. And with an array ref, you can have array ref arrow square brackets element. It would be really nice to also have arrow parens to be a code ref dereference in a linear way rather than having to do it with the stacked curly braces and stuff like that. And he goes, Yeah. Oh, that would be neat. That would be nice. But of course, it's too late. And I went, why is it too late? He goes, well, we're gold master. I can't change anything. It'd break things. But then there was eerie silence for about, must be 15, 20 minutes. And he comes back and he says, it passes all the tests. It's a 5-line code change. It's going in. All right. And that mostly happened because I said Larry wanted it. Now, yes, Larry wanted it. And yes, it was only a 5-line code change. So it goes in. So Larry did want it, but it was in a conversation I had with Larry 3 years prior. I didn't tell him the time frame of when I talked to Larry about putting the code referral in, but Chip got it in there for me. So that's the third feature I got into the language. Just those three. All right. By the way, I cannot see the chat at all at the same time I'm doing my slides, so hopefully nobody's saying anything like panicking or whatever. If there is a panic, please let me know audio wise. Okay, so moving on. First Pro Conference was in San Jose, August of '97. I taught a few classes, signed a lot of books. The Perl Conference for the first couple of years was just the Perl Conference, but Perl's Conference 3 turned out to be OSCON 1. So Tim O'Reilly and the team decided to expand how things were working. And things from that period are a bit fuzzy, so I don't have a lot to say about that. It was just really, really active in my life. I had so much going on. I had instructors flying all over the US. I myself was teaching probably 2 weeks a month on the road, all sorts of stuff. So I really have no stories to tell. So that's sort of how the Pearl Conference, which became OSCON, got started. Another thing that kind of grew up right around this area was the Perl Mongers. Brian, one of my business partners for a while, actually created that in New York because I joined the formal nonprofit board as it started. We had David Adler also there and Paul Smith. And it really came out of the fact that we were having regular meetings in a lot of cities for Pearl, and we wanted sort of an organized structure for it. And what's great is that meant that every time I was in New York, because I went to New York at least 1 week a month to teach classes at, I think it was Shearson, Lehman Brothers, and a couple of other places that were down there. And so I would frequently attend these meetings anyway. In fact, they would usually try to align them so that whenever they knew I was coming into town, they would have the meeting then. And of course, New York was a flagship, but eventually spread all over the world. We had multiple different kinds of meeting types, which you'll see the common element of all of them. We had like a technical meeting, which is a presentation, and then we head out to a bar to chat afterwards. There was a social meeting where we skipped the presentation and head right for the bar. There was a technical meeting where we sit through a presentation, then some of us go to the bar anyway. And then the emergency social, which would be like when I come into town, they would say, okay, we're definitely going to be meeting during this week because Randall's here. So that's kind of how that worked. You can kind of see the common element for all those, and it worked out pretty well. I also helped contribute to effective pro programming. Joseph Hall, one of my trainers, had co-wrote the prom class slides together. He invented the pegs diagram stuff, so all the railroad tracks and stuff that are on the document there, and then also in effective pro programming. He wanted to do a book like I had done, so he pitched the book idea to Addison, because he was familiar with Addison, and he also liked their book, Effective C++. And I helped with the pitch because I'd been through this before, and I knew what the acquisition editors were looking for in terms of a book because I had been through the process. And his target, of course, was intermediate and advanced pro programmers. I contributed my editing skills. I did a few pages. I did the preface. I also wrote the first time that anything's ever been written about printf, because it turns out all the man page had said about printf was it's just like C's printf, but that varies from system to system. So what does it really mean? And printf was actually fully implemented completely separately in Perl. So we figured we'd finally document that. The Alpaca book actually was, again, from teaching this prom course that Joseph and I had developed, picking up again where the Llama left off, same style, hour-long chapters, a few exercises, a few answers. And the Llama was roughly 4.5 days as a class, and the Alpaca was typically booked more as like 3 days. I occasionally would do just a lecture only version of it in one day, just to kind of as an update for people so they could get their Pearl 5 knowledge all quickly. Written almost entirely, like all my books, at Beaverton McMiniman's pub. And they have really wonderful microbrew. So I'd do like 2 pints of microbrew and then I'd start writing. And of course, every time I went in there, I had to sit at one of the 4 booths that had the power outlet at, because this is back when batteries didn't last more than an hour or two. And luckily now I have a laptop that lasts like 6 or 7 hours. Don't have to like go running for outlets anymore like I used to have to. And it was originally called, by O'Reilly, called Learning Perl Objects, References, and Modules. And I hated that title. It wasn't even like in the right order. It wasn't PROM. It was PORM. So it was LPORM. And I hated that title. I suggested Intermediate Perl. And I thought that would be a much better name. People understand I've got Learning Perl, then Intermediate Perl, and maybe Advanced Perl, because that actually was already out. Somebody else had written that. And then Mastering Perl, written by Brian. So I kind of figured this book would fit right in there. But the editor we had at the time at O'Reilly said, books like that don't sell. People don't know why they would buy like an intermediate book. What the heck would that be about? And so the more complex name was used, LPORM. And it was such a mouthful. It was awful. I kept having to tell people the Alpaca book. That's really the only name I had for it, because couldn't use that name. So what's funny is for the second edition, got a new editor, and the new editor said, "What's wrong with Intermediate Pearl? Well, let's just use that." And I went, "Yeah, where were you a couple years ago, right?" So yeah, so it sells quite well. It was a great book. A lot of people have it. Um, it does make it interesting though when people say, "I have your book." I never know which one of my books they're talking about, and I always have to clarify that. And they go, "Well, of course, the Llama," and I go, "Well, that's not an of course. I've written a bunch of books." So like that. Back to OSCON for a second. The Stonehenge parties. So Stonehenge, my company, right? We started the tradition for these huge parties, like really, really huge parties, in 2000 when TPC4, OSCON 2 was going to be in Monterey, and we knew we could find some good bars down there to be able to have a good party at. The Stonehenge party was never an official OSCON event. So you may not know this about like conferences like OSCON. They will sell vendors a package to have a party. And that would mean promotion in all the official documentation. That would mean some sort of interaction with the venue and that kind of thing, some sort of guarantees. Um, but we never did it that way. Bill was just crazy and would just go with me to one of the local bars, and he knew how to speak the lingo and would pitch them a story about how many people would show up and what kinds of drinks we'd like to have, and give them a fixed price for it. And so Bill could do it cheaper and more flexibly rather than paying going through O'Reilly. As an example, I think parties that we typically spent only about 10,000 on would have been 30,000 or 40,000 to go through O'Reilly to do. So yeah. So what's great, of course, is that since we were doing our own parties, we could advertise it whatever way we wanted to, and we did it by having a booth and gave away T-shirts and stuff. But what's great is Tim O'Reilly actually came to one of my parties, so it's great. It's not an official OSCON party, but he wanted to check it out. He wanted to see what it was like. And Derek Story, who for a long time was the official photographer for O'Reilly, also came and shot a bunch of pictures and put them on the official OSCON pages. So again, not an official OSCON party, and yet everybody came to our parties. And people always made sure that our night didn't conflict with theirs. People would call us up and say, "So OSCON this year, when's your party?" And we would say it's always Wednesday. And so we would that would make sure, because they had people that had scheduled official OSCON parties across from ours and gotten disappointing results because everybody was at our party. Always the blowout party. And again, the reason I could afford to do these is that uh, my classes were selling at about 20,000 a week, and that was a bundled price. That's everything. That includes the instructor, the materials, the delivery, travel, everything, just a fixed price. And about 10,000 of that was actually just pure profit for me and people I see, I guess, people I had to pay off, lawyers, things like that. And so we only had to sell to fund a $20,000 party. We only had to have 2 new clients out of it. But we had 3/4 of OSCON showing up at our parties, like 600, 700 people sometimes. And it was just great. It was just a lot of fun. And in fact, our parties were always a little crazy. I remember for the alpaca release, Bill actually figured out how to get a live alpaca from one of the local farms here in Portland, brought in on a truck and brought into the venue. I don't know how many health code violations we didn't get reported on, but definitely I'm sure there were a few. Sadly, the poor alpaca was frightened by the loud music. So we had a bit of a mismatch there as well. But that's the kind of stuff that we did. And it worked because what was the story the next day and all the social media at the time, Twitter and things like that, was, man, they had a live alpaca. So it was the kind of marketing things that Bill was really smart at figuring out how to do on the cheap. And he only promised just a little bit of money to the owner of the alpaca, enough to pay for gas to get to the venue, and also said, "Well, you can sell your alpaca dolls there, your little stuffed alpacas." And sadly, nobody bought one. So that was supposed to be part of his pay. But again, easier to seek forgiveness than ask permission. I know that from multiple ways now. I did mention podcasting earlier, right at the beginning of the show here. How did I get into podcasting? Well, it was actually kind of cool. Some of you are aware of Leo Laporte, who used to be on G4 TV, Game TV, and like that. And he started his own podcast network called Twit, This Week in Tech, and it had a bunch of other podcasts around that. And he came on one of the cruises that I went on, and I got to meet him. Now, he didn't know who I was, because I wasn't a podcaster, and I was just kind of a guy that seemed to be just hanging around, making sure the cruise was happening properly, Captain Neil. So we would have these things for Mac cruises called ingenious bars. Couldn't call them genius bars because that name was already taken, so they were ingenious bars. And eventually I got around to Leo asking, "Well, what do you do? What's your role here?" And I said, "Well, I wrote Learning Perl, and I've been on the first cruise, the Perl cruise, and a bunch of other things, right?" And he said, "Oh my goodness, I'm reading that right now." So we had instant respect for each other in that I had been watching him and all of his podcasting, and he had already been reading my books. So that was really cool. So I asked him about podcasting, and I started the newsletter for the cruises. I was doing feature speakers, past seminars, things like that. Um, he had just started a show called Floss Weekly. And I asked him then on the cruise, I said, "Well, how come you haven't had me on your open source podcast?" Because, I'm doing a lot of stuff. I wrote the Camel book and the Llama book and stuff. And he says, "Yeah, I don't know why we haven't had you yet. So I'll talk to Chris DeBona and I'll get him to contact you about being on the show." So I was on show number 9. And then around episode 17 of that show, Floss Weekly, everything kind of squirreled away and died. And so I took it over. I took it over first as a co-host, and then I was a showrunner. I did that for 13 years. I retired it 2 years ago, but I still occasionally now guest host on the revival of Floss Weekly. So I'm kind of the co-host position finally. I don't have to be the main host anymore. I love getting the 5 hours a week back that I was putting into that. And again, there I taped episode 284 again. And what's funny, of course, that Floss Weekly then got me more available to people. People knew me more widely from that. I did a bunch of magazine columns, actual hard copy magazine, real print stuff, for Unix Review, which was renamed later Performance Computing, Web Techniques, Perl Journal, Linux Magazine. What's great, of course, is that magazines die. So my column killed those magazines, I could say. Not really, but it's kind of funny. I did 255, just short of 2 to the power of 8, right? What's great, of course, is that every article is online. I made sure that when I was selling these columns to the publishers that I retained the rights for a not first publication, but after it was published in print, I would embargo it and then I would release it so that it was online. And what's funny about that is that I still occasionally have Perl questions and I use the Google, right? And when I Google for solutions, I often land on my own columns. So obviously they were useful because I had to find my own stuff to find out how to do my own thing. Um, all right. And some of the better ones were gathered for the book, eventually called Pearls of Wisdom, published by A Press. And one of the reviewers said the articles are the perfect length for a book kept in the smallest room of your home. I think they were trying to be clever about that, but it was definitely approaching that. So let's wrap this up because I'm getting close to being out of time here. Let's see. So I do want to give a bunch of thanks. Thank you to the Pearl community um, for just being around and letting me contribute to y'all as much as you've all contributed to me. It's just been a real wonderful potluck manner style contribution back and forth. I also want to thank the Perl developers and the CPAN contributors for writing stuff that I could put into production without being too freaked out about things. I also want to thank that there were enough clients for me to choose that used Perl so that I could get my paychecks and be able to pay the people that I needed to pay, and also allowed me to contribute some of the stuff I did for some of my clients back to the CPAN. So there's a few CPAN things that actually were originally contract work that I did for people. I also want to thank all the people I've worked with at Stonehenge over the years. Must be like 3 dozen at this point over time for delivering results that were good enough that over time, rather than people saying, I want Randal to teach a course, it was, I just want somebody from Stonehenge. I'm glad we were able to build up the company reputation to the point where it was a solid brand. I also want to thank Bill Harp, of course, for influencing me and therefore influencing Stonehenge, influencing Perl. Thank, of course, to Tim O'Reilly for publishing the books and also for having OSCON, because OSCON was definitely useful to me and useful to everybody to get more and more information about that. It kind of saddened me to watch Perl become a smaller and smaller and smaller part of OSCON, but I guess that was inevitable at some point. There's still lots of Perl being done, but it's a much smaller piece of a much bigger pie. And I also want to thank you all for letting me share these stories with you because it's good. I spent the first 50 years of my life, half of that was spent working with Perl for its 25 years. So very handy that that came out. But I also especially want to thank Larry Wall for just being brilliant and designing and implementing a tool that we could use for everything and then sharing that with the world so we could get stuff done while having an appropriate amount of fun. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing and we can start looking at some questions.
Excellent. Fabulous. Thanks so much, Randal. That was very entertaining and certainly fills in some of the questions that I had about that. That's really intriguing. I forgot to mention at the beginning of our broadcast, I want to thank the Perl and Raku Foundation for sharing their Zoom account with us. So we're doing it on the foundation's Zoom account, which is, it's a big fat corporate account, which we get as a benefit for being a nonprofit organization. So that's pretty handy. Okay, so if there are questions,
I'm
please.
scrolling through. Yes, I did mean D instead of B. B was before C. D is the one after C, and that's the one that has Schwartz sort. Is D.
All right.
I'm scrolling. You can keep talking while I'm doing this.
Yeah, I was going to say, it looks like somebody wanted to get in touch with you. So they could email you at merlin@stonehenge.com. Is that right?
Indeed, that's been my address for 25 years or so.
Well, yeah, and I was typing it into the chat. I thought, I better check.
Yeah, pretty fun. Yeah, that's the best address for me. What is the most beautiful programming language? Huh. What's the ugliest? Well, any one of those contrived ones are probably the ugliest ones. I'm not going to say the name of Brain F, but things like that. Yes, right. Definitely ugly there. But most beautiful programming language, I think I think in some senses, small talk would come close,
Hmm.
only because it's an extremely small syntax, not as small as Lisp, but extremely small syntax. And its idea of object trees and meta object trees and self-reflection are really, and duck typing so that you don't have to worry about hierarchies and implements and that sort of thing. Um, and it's good because I learned, like I said, I learned MVC from that. I learned objects in general, became very useful. The whole animal stuff I wrote about Perl to do the animal talk of animal and then have dog and cat inherit that. That all came right out of what I was reading in small talk books. So a lot of overlap that way. Let's see, keep reading here. What do you envision regarding long-term future of certain circular stone-based British? Oh, Stonehenge. You mean like the actual stones? I don't know what they're going to keep doing. I think they've worked out what now taking away one of the highways that went next to it or whatever to make it a little easier. I haven't been there in probably a dozen years, so but I have been there twice, so I actually have been to my namesake. And the first time I was wearing a Stonehenge hat. And as I went into the gift shop, I'm like looking around and they actually had a poster that said Stonehenge in a nutshell. And I went, oh my God, what an overlap. I have to have this. So I bought that. And as I get up to there, and I get up to the two girls behind the cash register and I said, I'm so excited to be here. I'm Stonehenge.com. I have a company named Stonehenge in the US. And she looks at me and in her perfect sort of low key British humor says, oh, that's why you have your own hat then. It just made me crack up. That was awfully, awfully wonderful of them to be able to produce that. Let's see, lots of memories, good ones. Yes, yes. This was just scratching the surface. There's so many experiences I went through. I just barely touched on the cruising, which came out of all this. Um, if you want, you should check out Karaoke for Fun and Profit in as an Ignite video. It's me. Look for my name as well, and that talks about how I got into the cruising and did that because of karaoke, and it's another couple of interesting intersections in my life. Yeah, career goal: have your own hat. I like that. That's great. Um, that's great. Still using Perl after 30 years. I do want to say that I did fire my last Perl client about 4 years ago. I am full-time now on Dart and Flutter. And I'm one of the 10 United States-based Google developer experts in Dart and Flutter. So that's a really high privilege, high status. Only about 100 of those in the US or in the world. And so I'm doing lots and lots of DevRel for Dart and Flutter, teaching people how to make really cool mobile apps and desktop apps, and going to conferences and stuff based on that, and speaking to lots of people about that and answering questions about that. What do you make of all the LLM programming models in AI? Yes, I played with quite a few. I think I, I'm not sure what exactly to say about it because it when it works amazingly well, but you can't tell when it's not working. That's the biggest fault it has for me. You have to be smarter than it to recognize that it has gone off the rails and how it's gone off the rails. So that's probably that. What do I miss the most from Perl when using Dart and Flutter? Regular expressions. Yes, Dart has regular expressions, but they're like the way Java does it, which is it's kind of a object you got to create, and then you call methods on. I so miss s/foo/bar. I so miss that I kind of wish it was in there somewhere. So, but that's life. Let's see. Am I missing any other questions earlier here? Let's see. Let's try to scroll back for a second. Um, And yeah, Lisp is both beautiful and ugly all at the same time. What else there? We got that. Schwartzian transform for CTEs and PGSQ. Oh, I love that. That's great. 4 hours to 8 seconds. Oh man, that is cool. That is very cool. Our t-shirts, by the way, we made sure that we had t-shirts to hand out. And again, Bill figured out how to make those t-shirts super cheap. We ended up buying t-shirt printing equipment. And so we printed, we had staff to do it, but we printed our own shirts most of the time. And we had shirts that went, a few of you will appreciate this, that went all the way up to triple XL because we knew we needed programmer size. So yeah, I don't mean to offend anybody who might need a triple XL, but that's really usually not a shirt size that people find. Let's see. I think that's getting most of them. We scroll back down at the bottom again in case people just type something in. Let's see. What do you believe to be the best features of Dart? Dart's interesting in that it was designed to be a boring language. First, it has to always be able to be compilable to JavaScript because one of the use cases is compiling a Dart app, typically a Flutter app, into JavaScript that works with all modern browsers. So the language has to be a semantic subset of JavaScript in the sense that it has to be able to be transpilable without having to invoke a lot of indirection and implementing a second layer of the system. In other words, the bools have to act like bools. But it does have more restrictions. Like in Dart, it's strongly typed. So if needs a bool, but it can figure the bool out, whether it's actually a bool, at compile time. And then at runtime, it just does a typical if statement with whatever value happens to be on the stack or whatever, right? So it doesn't need to do that same testing to see if it's literally true or literally false at runtime, and it still works pretty well. But Dart's great for that, and Dart compiles nicely in two different modes for native compilation. It does a mode that we use for debugging called just-in-time compilation, and a mode that we use for production called ahead-of-time compilation, which means that everything is tree shaken, optimize the hell out of it so that you get really tight, fast binaries that are comparable to native binaries on mobile and desktop. In fact, Ubuntu's installer is now written in Flutter. That's how far Flutter has come already. And the in-dash entertainment systems are now being done in Flutter. It's pretty much everywhere. So I made the right bet 10 years or 7 years ago when I got into Flutter and 10 years ago when I got into Dart. So I'm pretty happy about that. I'm watching for some more questions here. Gist. Why is somebody giving me a gist? Oh, that's your SQL stuff. Okay, cool. Okay, I'll look at that later. I better click on it now or else it won't show up later. And then I will save that for later. Oh my God, look, Schwartzian transform in SQL. That is so cool. That is so cool. Thank you for that immersion. Any more questions here? Let's see. Doing a blend of backend, Perl, PHP, Python, and Flask. What advice can you give me to stay updated? Wow. Get rid of PHP, please. Probably the first one. Well, a few people, even in the Perl community, don't know that the first version of PHP was actually written in Perl. And so it's always been a Perl wannabe, a catch-up to Perl, and it kept adopting somewhat badly features that Perl had in it, right? Yeah, Perl homepages was his first name. It became personal homepage after a while. So what we do in the Dart and Flutter world is we have a full Dart stack. So we use Dart to write the Flutter code, which is running on your mobile or your web pages. And then we use Dart as the back end, headless, to build essentially web servers. And these web servers can be hot reloaded, by the way. So that means that you can actually change the operating code, and between one transaction and the next, it will load the new code for you in the transactions. Really slick stuff. So great for 24/7 operations and things. But yeah, Dart's pretty interesting language. It's not full cross compile yet. Not like C, where you can take any machine and generate code for a different machine if you just have the right libraries. It's still pretty limited to whatever Google has figured out how to make Dart go from and to. What's my opinion on Perl 42? I think that's the new Perl. The future of Perl, well, again, not without spitting too much on the thing that made me the most money over my life. Let me at least just say that one of the reasons I was looking at Dart and eventually Flutter is that I saw what was happening with Perl 6, and I kind of went, that's not really going to go anywhere. I don't see writing books about that. I don't see making a living doing that, but I like some of the things they're doing. And then along came Dart, and it was everything I wanted from Perl 6, but already running in a language. And I went, oh, okay, I'm happy. I'm happy. I've got streams, I have futures, promises, I have infinite lists, I have generators, everything that I saw that was fun about Perl 6, I was able to get already in Dart 1. And we're already up to Dart 3 with even cooler stuff now. So I don't know. I've been out of Perl development enough that I don't know how different Perl 42 is. But I'm happy that development continues on it because I know that I have clients that are still doing Perl. I probably am not seeking, well, I'm definitely not seeking employment in Perl. I'm seeking employment only in Dart and Flutter these days. Um, and just peripherally keeping my ear to the ground about Perl. I still read the Perl blogs and things like that, but that's really about my limit of what I'm doing with that. We got any other questions coming in? We're getting close to the time I said we would stop. But
Yeah, I assume
keep
Perl
pushing
42
on.
is Perl 5.42.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Do I
Yeah.
still use Perl for personal projects? I don't start new projects with Perl. Uh, and I've been rewriting a few of my old Perl scripts as Dart because Dart can compile to a binary. And they run way faster. They start up way faster than Perl ever did. So, yeah, I would actually have to say at this point, my Perl is probably slightly rusty, but only in the same sense that I remember Larry one day talking about how he still has to look up on the man page how he did something. So I figure if Larry still has to look up things about Perl, that I'm forgiven also for doing the same. And as I said, it's one of the slides that, I'm Googling sometimes for Perl solutions to things, and I'm finding my own columns. I know there's a way to do this. Oh, yeah, this Randall guy wrote about it back about 15 years ago. Yeah, yeah, that's kind of cool. You can't see it because it's cleverly hidden behind Crater Lake here, which is an Oregon thing. And I'm Oregonian. I took that picture, by the way, 5 years ago. It was a beautiful picture. Um, you can't see this because luckily background illumination is happening, although you can see glimpses of it. There's a stack of about 10 boxes of first editions of all of my books. And I'm trying to figure out an appropriate place to distribute them because I really don't feel like keeping them anymore, or at least most of them, keeping like a few of each of the first editions. But I've got entire cases of 20 of first editions of some of these Perl books. So if anybody can come up with a way, I'm all ears.
Hmm.
Yep. Any other questions? I'm trying to think if I left anything out of the talk. No, it's pretty comprehensive. I mean, again, I only deviated from script maybe a couple times to talk about things that have happened since
Yeah.
the end or since I gave that.
You know what?
But
It's
yeah,
all interesting to hear about Randall.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
And I lived it.
yeah, you were there. I mean, jumping.
uh,
I think the very beginning of your career, where you started off to being a technical writer, I thought, gee, you're interested in writing code, but instead you were a technical writer. But
yeah,
you made that work, and then that was really useful later on when it came to start writing the Camel. Oh, well, actually, I program, but I also have a lot of experience as a writer, so
yep.
I've got a foot in both of those worlds. Away we go.
My
And
life is full of that kind of accidental serendipity. I have been accidentally at the right place at the right time to do a lot of really, really cool things. And of course, get 3 felonies. So I guess it kind of works out average in the end. But, um, but I was making enough money hand over fist to have the huge parties and educating. I mean, we had 17 out of the Fortune 100 companies as clients of Stonehenge. So I was teaching for the big guys. I was teaching on Wall Street, which was amazing, meeting all the people there and then conversing with people that were, learning Perl for their Wall Street jobs. And then we would go out and party and go to a Perl Mongers meeting afterward and hearing their stories about funds that they managed and things like that. It was kind of cool living vicariously through them for a while. Um, but and then the cruises. I mean, I've been in 68 countries because of the cruises, and I wouldn't have gone on the first cruise had it not been oh man, Captain Neil Bauman had been in one of my classes and wanted to put together a cruise with Pearl because he thought Pearl's really cool, and he was also interested in cruising and making a business out of it. And then he asked me to be a speaker on his cruise, and I'd never wanted to be on a cruise ship before, and that was about 100 cruises ago. So,
Wow.
it's just worked out. And that's how I met Leo Laporte and got into podcasting. It's like this, all of my life has been this weird sequence of accidental meetings that just kept propelling things forward. And it's no surprise that there's a Wikipedia page about me as just part of the
Ah,
outcome of this,
that's
because
quite a life goal, right?
yeah, a lot of stuff happened. Well, here's the best part. Okay, so I've been saying a long time now that the reason that my life is so crazy is that I'm hoping that when I finally finish my autobiography, they're going to put it in fiction because it couldn't have all happened to one guy. And and I think I'm pretty good at that goal. I think I'm getting pretty close. But just 9 months ago, I found out that I had a 40-year-old daughter, thanks to 23andMe, and I didn't know about. So there's a whole nother chapter from my new book. It's like I have a family off somewhere. Just the weirdest stuff happens to me. It's just
Wow.
crazy. Yeah. And a grandson and soon to be a great granddaughter. So it's
Wow.
like poof, instant
The
family.
never-ending
Yeah.
story of Randal Schwartz.
I know, I know. That's why I kind of in this talk I had to kind of limit a lot of stuff I talk about because if I actually went into a lot of detail, it'd be more like, no, that couldn't happen.
You're
Yeah,
making
yeah,
that up. What?
yeah, right. It's like, well, how did I know about Git, right? I knew about Git because Linus Torvalds was on one of the cruises, so I became friends with him, and then he moved to Portland, Oregon, living just down the street from where I was living. And so I invited him out to lunch. And so we had lunch, and I'm sitting there chatting with him. And I say, "So what are you working on these days?" And he says, "Linux kernel." And I said, "Yeah, I figured that." And he says, "And we just lost BitKeeper, and so I'm creating this thing called Git." He described it to me. And I said, "Well, does it run on OpenBSD and Mac OS? Because those are the two things I had." And I figured it only ran on Linux. And he said, "I don't know. Why don't you download it and find out?" And that's how I became involved with Git in the second month of its existence. I was
Wow.
the canary in the coal mine for non-Linux systems for Git.
Yeah.
It's just one more thing. It's like, how was I in the right place at the right time to, and then I gave the first Google Tech Talk, the serious Tech Talk on Git at Google. It was
You may have jumped
crazy.
into that with in a big way.
Yeah, yeah, crazy
Yeah, and
stuff. Anyway, any more
well,
questions here? Let's see, and then we can wrap up otherwise. Um, let's see. No, I'm not seeing really anything. I like the thank you for training at different companies I worked for through the years. Yeah. Oh, Gene. Yeah, of course. Yes, I remember seeing Gene in person a bunch of times. Yeah, Randall, the Forrest Gump of tech. I like that. I'll take that. That may be the subtext, the subtitle of my book. That'll be funny, but nobody will get it that didn't see the movie. Cool.
thanks for attending the Randal Schwartz talk tonight. Coming in March, the Toronto Perl Mongers present Dave Cross talking about still munching data with Perl. You can register for this event on the Llama website, lu.ma. Thanks very much and good night.